Every time I mention this material in one of my videos or in one of my Instagram posts, I'm always asked a stream of questions about it. And it's this stuff called wadding. And so this video will be all about it, how I mix it, how I use it, and how I remove it from pots once they've been fired. I use it to prop lids up on the jars below them, and even place them on the bottoms of pots sometimes. There's a surprising amount you can do with this material, and you'll find endless recipes online, but here's how I mix mine up. Into a dry, empty bucket, I'm going to be placing 50% coarse alumina hydrate and 50% kaolin, or china clay. Alumina hydrate is very refractory, meaning it has a very high melting point, much hotter than what my kiln will fire to. I prefer the coarse variant as it creates wadding that's not quite as fine and it feels like it sticks to the clay less. The clay itself is needed to stop the alumina from fusing together, and of course helps make it into a clay-like material that's much easier to work with. So, as I've added 1000 grams of alumina hydrate, I'll then add 1000 grams of kaolin, which, as it's a much lighter material, it always feels as if you're adding much more of this. You'll even find some potters who add things such as flour and sawdust to their wadding recipes. These burn away during the firing, creating voids in the wadding itself, and thus making them easier to grind away. This is typically more useful for when you're wood firing or soda firing, as the atmospheric glazes can really soak into the waddings and fuse them tightly to the pots. Whereas if you're using them in a gas kiln or in an electric kiln where the firing atmospheres are more stable, then doing this isn't quite so important. Yet this is still partly the reason I use a coarse alumina, as in the off chance that I do need to grind them away, it should be easier to do so. With the 2 kilos of dry raw material in the bucket, I pack things away before starting on the next step of the process. With the lid tightly sealed, I thoroughly mix the powders together. Now, the reason that I don't add water first is that when you add water to this combination of materials, is that it seems to go from being lumpy and dry to a very thin watery slurry in an instance, the latter being quite unusable. So instead, I mix them like this really thoroughly, and then I'll leave the bucket for about half an hour or longer to allow the dust to settle. And then with a mask on and very carefully, I add water slowly to this mixture. And I can't stress this enough. Really do add the water slowly, bit by bit. When it's lumpy, like this, just add a splash of water and that should be enough to bring it all together. There have been times where I've added just slightly too much at this stage, and it all turns incredibly thin and watery, and the whole lot has to be put on a plaster bat to dry out. Once it resembles something like this, it's more or less ready to use. But if you feel like it isn't properly mixed, you can wedge it like the clay you normally work with. But don't expect it to feel quite the same. I then store mine in a bucket, and normally, whenever I close it, I give it a thorough spray with water. As this stuff seems to dry out really quickly, I then push some plastic into the bucket, pressing it tightly against the wadding, and then I click the well-fitting lid back into place. With the wadding mixed up, I'll now show you how I use it in a few different ways. For my own work, waddings get used the most for any of the lidded pots I make. I always fire these pots together, the lids propped up by 5 balls of wadding, which I always press against unglazed regions of the pot, as it makes removing them after they've been fired much easier. In fact, in most cases, these waddings that only touch bare clay simply pop off with a tiny bit of pressure with my finger, but if the glaze has stuck to them, then you do have to be much more careful about how they're removed, otherwise you risk damaging the pot itself, as the wadding plucks away some of the glaze or the clay body as it's removed. With the lid clean, I can move on to the body of the jar. I use a small paring knife to scrape away the worst of the drips, and I use my fingertips and thumb to remove the larger ones and to rub over the tongue marks that are left over from when the pot is dipped in glaze. I then clean over the base thoroughly, removing any specks of glaze that can otherwise settle on the wax. As for the rim of the jar, which is where the waddings are going to attach to, I clean this part on the wheel, the vessel very carefully centered, and then I use a small, soaked sponge and hold it in place as the wheel spins. This way I'm able to get a much cleaner line around the top. Every now and then, especially on bigger pieces, I rinse the sponge out, as it very quickly clogs with glaze, and it won't remove it quite so neatly. And with the rim clean and void of any glaze that might otherwise stick to the waddings that go here, I'll move on to attaching the waddings themselves. I roll the material into a coil, and if it feels as if it's falling apart and crumbling as you do this, it means it's a touch too dry. I then cut away tiny segments, roughly 5 pieces for each pot. I then attach them equally spaced all the way around the lid, and I find they stick really nicely to any waxed surface. But you can also use PVA glue, which I tend to pour into a little bowl, and then I dip the waddings into that before attaching them to the pot. But in this case, with just a firm press against the wax, they hold very securely in place. I then carefully place the lid onto the jar, making sure that the clay of the internal locating flange isn't touching the pot below it. The waddings should hold the lid aloft, and if I feel like a wadding is just a bit too close to the glaze, I just nudge it away slightly. And now finally the pot is ready to be packed into the gas kiln. With the lid propped up, the 2 pieces fired together. By firing them together, I save space in the kiln, and it also guarantees that the 2 components will match each other, as in reduction-fired atmospheres, you can get some variation in tone across the surface of pots, and if I fired them separately, I'd run the risk of the 2 parts not quite feeling right for each other. Lastly, as the rims of my jars are thrown in trim to be quite fine, firing the pot with the lid in place helps to keep the lip of the jar nice and circular. As this material does dry out so quickly, I find that sometimes sponging down the surface I'm working on helps to keep the small pieces of wadding nice and malleable so that the lids can be pressed down securely onto the bodies. With that being said, when I push the lid down onto the jar, I don't push them down so much that the wadding material gets squashed out in all directions, potentially touching the glaze around it. Instead, the lid is pushed down just enough to make sure it sits securely. Now, although I don't really do this for any of my pots these days, I thought it would be worth demonstrating it regardless. If you are using a particularly fluid glaze, or if you've glazed the entire base of the pot itself, then you can position 3 waddings onto the base like so, just to create some distance between the mug and the kiln shelf. This way, if the glaze does flow, hopefully it doesn't stick the pot down. Really, putting waddings on the bottom of your pots is something you only really need to do if you're firing with wood, salt or soda kilns, as without waddings, the soda you spray into the kiln that turns to glaze would simply fuse all the pots to the kiln shelves if they didn't have these little feet. So during my apprenticeship with Lisa Hammond, it was my job to glue these waddings onto the bases of all the pots we made, 3 of them, like the feet of a tripod. Yet, on larger forms we would use more, although we'd never use an even number, as I was told that was bad luck. All of the wadded pots would then be placed into the kiln, which means as an additional step to the firing process, it really does add a lot of time, but with some firing methods it's just an absolute necessity. In most cases the waddings could just easily be pried away, but in some instances the vaporized soda would cover the waddings, which means they then need to be very carefully removed with a rotary diamond tool and a bench grinder. And of course, this method does leave permanent marks on the bottoms of your pots, but I personally quite like those. They're remnants of how they were made and how they were fired. You can even use shells to do this same job. In this case, the shells are filled with the wadding material and then glued to the foot ring of the pot. This plate can then be placed on top of another, or even fired in stacks up to 5 high. But this does of course, again, leave permanent marks on the bases of your pots. And the imprints they leave can be really lovely, and the shells themselves, once fired, simply dissolve in water, but they don't always leave perfect imprints. You may find in your potting life that some props aren't totally flat, and in those cases I simply squash thin discs of the material, place it on top of the prop, and then put the shelf down, and this usually makes for a very stable layer. Wadding is also the material I use to prop up my pyrometric cones for firing. These are the devices that measure heat work, and I can look at them during the firing through spy holes in the kiln's door, yet the cones themselves need to be placed in a very specific way, leaning slightly over to one side, even before the firing. You can use just clay for this, but so far I've had absolutely no problems using this material. The only thing worth mentioning is that it's best not to fire these when the material is still wet, as these aren't bisque fired, which means that they could potentially explode when all the moisture in the wadding suddenly turns to steam. And with all the pots and cones packed inside, I'll then gas fire the pots up to 1290 degrees Celsius in a reduction atmosphere, a process that takes about 9 hours from start to finish, and then about a day or so before it cools down to a point it can actually be unpacked. Here are what those cones look like once they've been fired. With the firing concluded, the door can be swung open and all the pots unpacked and the waddings between lid and jar removed. In most cases, as long as my waddings have been placed accurately, the lids will come off really easily, and any waddings that are stuck simply come off with a tiny bit of pressure applied to them. But if a wadding touches the glaze, even just by a tiny bit, it can end up sticking quite badly. Despite these lids coming off nicely, as the sandy stoneware has now been fired and shrunk, as the clay recedes around the particles of sand, the surfaces of bare clay become rougher, so each will need to be ground smooth so the lid spins in place with a glassy smoothness. These are all my fired waddings that I've collected over the last 4 years, and at some point I'll grind them all back down to a fine powder and I'll incorporate it into a new batch of wadding I mix. This is the stuff I use to grind my lids, and I actually made a much longer video recently all about tidying up pots post-firing, and I'll leave a link to that on screen now and in the description below. But essentially this gel contains carborundum powder and it helps to polish clean the join between lid and jar, and after being washed off with hot soapy water it leaves the pot with a gloriously silky finish. Now, for the waddings on the basis of pots, if they don't just pop off like they did on my jars, then you might have to use a rotary grinding tool like this to carefully grind each one away without accidentally scratching the base of the pot itself. Or you can use a tungsten carbide scraper like this to scrape them away, but you should only do this if you're confident that the abruptly removed wadding won't tear away some of the clay underneath it. I also use wadding to create these small trays to fire test tiles in. This way, if the experimental glaze on them does happen to run, then it won't flow onto the expensive kiln shelves or pots nearby. And that's it really. I'm sure this material has dozens of other uses, but I'm always surprised by how few potters actually use it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.